Hello, my friends. I want to begin by stripping away the optimism that many commentators are deliberately injecting into the current phase of U.S.-Ukraine negotiations. If one listens only to official statements, press releases, and carefully curated sound bites, it is easy, almost tempting, to believe that the war in Ukraine is approaching its conclusion, that the hard work has already been done, and that only technical details remain. This narrative is comforting. It is also profoundly misleading. Yes, discussions between Washington and Kyiv are continuing. Yes, Volodymyr Zelensky is preparing for high-profile meetings with Donald Trump. And yes, Western media is framing these encounters as decisive turning points. But if you read carefully, if you analyze what is actually being said, rather than how it is being sold, a very different picture emerges, one that is far less optimistic and far more unstable. Let us start with Zelensky himself. In recent statements, he has argued that the United States is offering Ukraine security guarantees lasting 15 years, with the possibility of extension. In exchange, he claims he would be willing to submit Donald Trump's proposed peace plan to a national referendum, but only if Russia agrees to a ceasefire of at least 60 days. That condition alone tells us almost everything we need to know about how detached Kyiv remains from strategic reality. This is not the first time Zelensky has shifted his criteria. Earlier, Western leaders, including Trump, floated the idea that Ukraine should hold elections prior to any final settlement. Zelensky resisted this fiercely. Then the narrative changed. Elections were quietly shelved, replaced by the idea that only territorial concessions would require popular approval. Now, once again, the scope has expanded, not just territory, but the entire so-called 20-point peace plan would be put to a referendum. This pattern is not accidental. It is a textbook example of moving the goalposts. Each time negotiations approach a concrete decision point, the criteria shift. What begins as a narrow procedural requirement becomes an expansive political obstacle. And this is precisely why Moscow does not and will not take these proposals at face value. Zelensky's demand for a 60-day ceasefire is particularly revealing. Russian officials have already made it clear that such a prolonged pause is unacceptable. Vladimir Putin himself stated weeks ago that under certain conditions, Russia might consider a very limited halt on the order of a single day for specific operational reasons. 60 days, however, would serve only one purpose: allowing Ukraine to regroup, reorganize, resupply, and stabilize its internal political situation. From a Russian strategic perspective, this would be irrational. Zelensky insists that the referendum process would face logistical and security challenges. That is true, but those challenges are of his own making. Ukraine is in no position to organize a nationwide vote under wartime conditions, and everyone involved knows it. The referendum demand functions not as a genuine democratic mechanism, but as a delaying tactic. Zelensky also claims he wants to secure a better position on territorial questions. That statement alone underscores the fundamental disconnect between Kyiv's political rhetoric and the military reality on the ground. Territory is not negotiated based on aspirations. It is negotiated based on control, capability, and leverage. And Ukraine currently has none of the latter. He further suggests that Russia may not accept the 20-point plan being discussed with Washington. On this point, at least, he is correct. There is little chance, close to zero, that Moscow will endorse a framework that diverges so sharply from what it has already negotiated directly with the United States. This brings us to a crucial but deliberately underreported fact. There are two different peace frameworks in circulation. One is the 20-point plan being discussed between Washington and Kyiv. The other is the framework Russia negotiated with the United States earlier, reportedly consisting of 27 or 28 points and anchored in a set of understandings reached between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Anchorage, Alaska. These two frameworks are not minor variations of the same idea. They are, as Russian officials have bluntly stated, radically different. And that difference is not an accident. It reflects competing strategic visions. Kiev's version assumes continued Western backing, long-term security guarantees resembling NATO's Article 5 and a reconstituted Ukrainian military. Moscow's version assumes the opposite: a neutralized Ukraine, a new European security architecture, and an end to the bloc-based confrontation that has defined the post-Cold War era. Western media has fixated on the duration of U.S. security guarantees, 15 years versus longer, treating this as the primary dispute between Trump and Zelensky. That is superficial analysis. The real disagreement is not about timeframes. It is about authority and control. Even NATO's Article 5 is deliberately vague. It does not mandate automatic military intervention. It leaves the ultimate response in Washington's hands. Donald Trump understands this perfectly. He is not going to issue a blank check financially or militarily to Ukraine. And when he says that Zelensky has nothing until I approve it, this is not mere bluster. It is a clear assertion of hierarchy. Kyiv is not negotiating from a position of equality. It is petitioning. Trump has also announced plans for another call with Vladimir Putin. That, more than any meeting with Zelensky, is where the real decisions will be shaped, because no agreement between Washington and Kyiv has any meaning unless Moscow accepts it. This is the fundamental truth that Western narratives continue to obscure. Meanwhile, European actors, particularly France, are pushing their own parallel initiatives. French officials speak of security guarantees being finalized in January, centered around a strong Ukrainian army and long-term Western support. But when we examine the details, the hollowness becomes obvious. What does a strong Ukrainian army actually mean? Zelensky has floated figures ranging from 600,000 to 800,000 troops. Russia, by contrast, has publicly estimated Ukraine's effective force at 60,000 to 80,000. That gap is not narrowing, it is widening. Claims of rebuilding Ukraine's military strength are aspirational fantasies, not realistic plans. The so-called coalition of the willing proposes multiple layers of guarantees. The first is sustained support for Ukrainian forces. The second is the symbolic presence of Western troops, carefully described as non-combat, non-monitoring, and largely ceremonial. Ceasefire monitoring, we are told, would be conducted remotely via technology. In other words, flags, uniforms, and press releases, but no real commitment. The third layer, the backstop, is where the rhetoric becomes most dangerous. This would involve U.S. guarantees modeled on NATO's Article 5, signaling that any renewed conflict would trigger confrontation not just with Ukraine, but with its allies. For Russia, this is not a security guarantee. It is a provocation. For more than 2 decades, Moscow has called for a new European security architecture, one that includes Russia rather than excludes it, and one that is not explicitly designed to contain or threaten it. Those calls have been ignored. What is being proposed now is simply a rebranded continuation of bloc politics with all the same risks and none of the lessons learned. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov made this explicit. He stated plainly that the plan currently being discussed with Ukraine differs radically from what Russia and the United States had already worked on. More importantly, he emphasized that staying within the framework agreed in Anchorage is not optional, it is an imperative. Without that political will, there will be no agreement at all. This statement carries a subtle but unmistakable message. The Anchorage framework was negotiated between 2 actors with real power, Russia and the United States. Ukraine was not at the table then, and its subsequent attempts to reshape the outcome do not change that fact. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a process that is being marketed as peace, but structured for delay, a process in which Kyiv continues to demand guarantees it cannot enforce. Europe offers symbolism instead of substance, and Washington retains ultimate veto power, while Moscow remains the only actor speaking with strategic consistency. The war will not end because of referendums that cannot be held, armies that cannot be rebuilt, or guarantees that are intentionally ambiguous. It will end only when political reality aligns with military reality. And at this stage, that alignment is occurring not in Kyiv, not in Paris, and not in Brussels, but in Moscow. Until Western leaders accept that truth, every breakthrough will remain an illusion, and every new plan just another rearrangement of the same failed assumptions. What we are witnessing now is not the closing chapter of the Ukraine war, but the final exposure of a narrative that has been sustained far longer than reality could support. The illusion of leverage in Kyiv, the pretense of unity in Europe, and the carefully staged optimism coming out of Washington are all colliding with a far less forgiving force. Strategic facts on the ground. Wars do not end because politicians announce timelines or because press offices circulate talking points. Wars end when power, will, and capability converge. And in this conflict, that convergence is occurring on one side only. Ukraine is being asked to legitimize a settlement it does not control through mechanisms it cannot realistically execute, such as national referendums under wartime conditions. Europe is offering security guarantees that are deliberately ambiguous, militarily hollow, and politically reversible. The United States, despite all the noise, is positioning itself exactly where great powers always position themselves in such moments, as the final arbiter, not the guarantor of someone else's survival. And Russia, unlike its counterparts, is not improvising. It is insisting calmly, methodically, and relentlessly on a framework that reflects its security interests, its battlefield position, and its long articulated demands for a post-Cold War order that actually includes Russia rather than encircles it. The critical mistake made by Western planners was believing that time was on their side. It was not. Every month that passed without a decisive Ukrainian victory strengthened Moscow's hand. Every escalation, framed as support, only deepened Ukraine's dependency while exhausting Western stockpiles, political patience, and public credibility. The longer this war dragged on, the clearer it became that slogans could not substitute for strategy, and symbolism could not substitute for power. Russia understands something its adversaries still resist, acknowledging peace imposed on fantasy is not peace at all. Any agreement that ignores the military balance, dismisses Russian red lines, or attempts to lock in NATO-style guarantees under a different name is not a settlement, it is merely a pause before a larger confrontation. Moscow has no incentive to accept such an arrangement and no pressure compelling it to do so. This is why the Anchorage framework matters. It represents the last serious attempt to ground diplomacy in reality rather than aspiration. It was negotiated between actors who actually possess the authority to enforce outcomes. Everything that has followed, referendums, expanded point plans, coalitions of the willing, has been an effort to dilute, delay, or repackage that reality. And it has failed. The uncomfortable truth is that the war's end will not look like a Western victory narrative. It will not validate years of rhetoric about weakening Russia or defending abstract principles at no cost. Instead, it will underscore a lesson as old as geopolitics itself. Security cannot be built against a major power without eventually confronting that power directly, and the West has neither the unity nor the appetite for that confrontation. Russia does not need to rush. It does not need to convince Western audiences. It only needs to remain consistent, patient, and aligned with its strategic objectives. In contrast, Ukraine faces shrinking options, Europe faces strategic irrelevance, and the United States faces a choice it has long postponed: accept a negotiated reality shaped by power, or continue chasing illusions that prolong suffering without altering the outcome. History will not judge this conflict by who spoke most passionately about values, but by who understood the limits of force and the costs of denial. And when that judgment is rendered, it will be clear that the end of this war was never decided in press conferences or peace plans. It was decided the moment one side refused to accept a world that no longer exists, while the other adapted to the one that does. I want to address what is arguably the most important strategic and political shift taking place in Europe today, a shift that is being deliberately obscured by NATO officials and Western media talking points. While headlines focus on personalities, Zelensky, Trump, or individual ministers. The real story is the accelerating ideological and structural fracture between the United States and the European Union. This fracture is no longer theoretical. It is real, visible, and irreversible. Let me begin with the recent remarks by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Rutte publicly rejected the idea that Europe should separate militarily from the United States, insisting that Washington remains a reliable and committed security partner. On the surface, this sounds reassuring, even conventional. But when you examine the political context, Rutte's statement is less a declaration of confidence and more an act of damage control. The first question that must be asked is simple. Who is calling for Europe to decouple from the United States? These calls are not coming from Russia, China, or any external adversary. They are coming from Europeans themselves. That alone should tell us something profound is changing inside Europe's political class. For decades, the transatlantic relationship functioned on ideological alignment. The United States and Western Europe shared a broadly similar worldview, liberal globalism, interventionism framed as humanitarianism, and an unquestioned belief in American leadership. There was even an old saying that captured this dependency perfectly. When the United States sneezed, Europe caught a cold. American political, cultural, and social trends inevitably flowed across the Atlantic and reshaped Europe in their image. That alignment is now gone. The turning point was not subtle. It arrived with the return of Donald Trump to power and, more importantly, with the consolidation of the MAGA movement as a governing ideology. MAGA is fundamentally incompatible with the bureaucratic, technocratic, post-national vision that dominates Brussels. Trump's America does not see itself as the guarantor of European security for ideological reasons. It sees alliances as transactional, conditional, and subordinate to American national interest. This ideological rupture was put on full display at the Munich Security Conference when J.D. Vance delivered a blistering critique of the European Union shortly after Trump's inauguration. That speech was not an accident, nor was it merely rhetorical. It was a declaration that the United States no longer views the EU as a junior ideological partner, but as a diverging political entity with fundamentally different priorities. European elites understand this perfectly well, even if they refuse to say it openly. They do not trust their security to a United States that is no longer ideologically aligned with them. That is the core issue, far more than any alleged uncertainty in American politics. Which brings me to Manfred Weber, leader of the European People's Party, who openly questioned whether Europe can continue relying on Washington for its security. He framed this as a response to political uncertainty in the United States, but that is a deliberate mischaracterization. There's nothing uncertain about American politics at the moment. Trump is in control. Policies are being implemented. The direction is clear. What Weber and others really mean is divergence, not uncertainty. Weber went further, arguing that Europe cannot expect Trump to deliver peace with American soldiers alone, and that European forces should operate under a European flag as part of future security arrangements in Ukraine. This statement is extraordinarily revealing. A flag is not a piece of fabric. A flag represents sovereignty, power, legitimacy, and identity. When Weber calls for European troops under a European flag, he is not talking about Ukraine. He is talking about Europe's long-term ambition to become an autonomous geopolitical actor. If NATO were to provide security guarantees, troops would operate under a NATO flag. But NATO is not the European Union. The EU and NATO overlap in membership, but they are not the same project. A European flag on European troops is a symbolic and political step toward a European military identity independent of Washington. This is why Mark Rutte's position is so carefully worded. He is not opposing European military autonomy in practice. He is opposing the framing of that autonomy as a break from NATO. The concern is not strategy, it is narrative. For decades, Europeans were told that the United States was the beacon of freedom, the leader of the free world. If Brussels moves too quickly to distance itself from Washington, ordinary Europeans might start asking uncomfortable questions. Why abandon the beacon of freedom? Why now? What changed? The answer, of course, is that the myth no longer holds. But myths cannot be dismantled overnight without consequences. That is why this decoupling must be slow, gradual, and obscured by diplomatic language. Over time, people forget. A new normal emerges. Against this backdrop, we must also consider the statements coming from Kiev. Zelensky has openly declared that U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine depend entirely on Donald Trump. This statement serves two purposes. First, it flatters Trump's ego by portraying him as the sole decision-maker capable of delivering guarantees. Second, it places personal pressure directly on Trump. If Ukraine does not receive what it wants, Trump, not the U.S. government as a whole, becomes the villain. This is a dangerous game, and Trump understands it better than Zelensky likely realizes. Ukraine's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, then declared that 2025 represents the final awakening of Europe. According to him, this awakening is driven by changes in U.S. policy, meaning Trump, along with alleged Russian threats and hybrid warfare. Notice the order of causes. The first factor is not Russia, it is the United States. This is an extraordinary admission. The so-called awakening of Europe is not a response to Russian aggression. It is a response to the realization that the United States is no longer a predictable ideological patron. Sybiha went further, claiming that Ukraine has become an integral part of Europe's new security architecture due to its battlefield experience and technological innovations. He described Ukraine's path toward the EU as systematic, constant, and irreversible. I cannot help but note the irony of that word, irreversible. We were told that Ukraine's path toward NATO was irreversible. We all know how that turned out. What we are witnessing now is not European strength, but European anxiety. The EU is scrambling to redefine itself in a world where American guarantees are conditional and Russian power has proven resilient, adaptive, and effective. Ukraine is being rhetorically folded into this European project, not because it strengthens Europe, but because Europe needs justification for its own militarization and consolidation. Russia, meanwhile, remains the fixed point around which all these contradictions revolve. Despite sanctions, despite military pressure, despite endless propaganda, Russia has forced Europe and the United States into strategic and ideological reckoning with themselves. The truth is uncomfortable for Western elites, which is why it is rarely stated plainly. The transatlantic order is fracturing not because of Russian actions, but because the ideological glue that once held it together has dissolved. Russia did not create this reality. Russia merely exposed it. And that exposure, more than anything happening on the battlefield, will define Europe's future. And so we return to the real point of departure. Mar-a-Lago can deliver polished photographs, carefully scripted remarks, and headlines announcing progress in negotiations. But wars do not end under camera flashes. They end when one side accepts reality and the other stops disguising that reality with comforting language. If Donald Trump truly wanted peace, the path would be brutally simple and politically dangerous. Cut off the oxygen of the war. Not speeches about Nobel Prizes, not self-congratulation about replacing the United Nations, but concrete action, shutting down the flow of money, weapons, and false hope that Ukraine can somehow reverse the battlefield. Yet such a decision would collide head-on with entrenched interests in Washington, with an entire system built on prolongation rather than resolution. And so peace is talked about far more than it is enforced. From Moscow's perspective, the equation is no longer complicated. Russia has heard enough promises, seen too many agreements turn into temporary traps, and watched too many ceasefires exploited to rearm and prepare the next confrontation. Accepting a soft peace, now a frozen conflict designed to give NATO time to reload, would not be peace at all. It would be a deferred war. What many in the West label as Russian hardline thinking is, in reality, strategic survival. If this conflict ends, it must end permanently. That is why the real turning point is not at a dining table in Mar-a-Lago, but in a far more uncomfortable question that Washington avoids answering openly. Is the United States willing to force Kyiv to stop, or is it merely staging negotiations to buy time? If the former happens, the war could end quickly. If not, if this is only another media intermission, then history will record it without sentiment. Russia offered exits, while the other side chose delay. And when the purchase time finally runs out, reality will write the final agreement. Not a 20-point document, not a press conference, but the only arbiters left when diplomacy empties itself of substance, power, endurance, and the cost of illusion. A new year approaches, and the word peace will be spoken endlessly. But peace is not a wish, nor a slogan. It is a structure. And if the West refuses to build it on truth, then it will be built instead from steel, fire, and ruins. That is when the performance ends, because the stage itself no longer exists.